What happens when the narrow strip of water that moves 20% of the world's oil supply becomes a war zone? Not a hypothetical war zone, not a geopolitical risk scenario buried in a research paper that nobody outside a think tank ever reads. An actual active conflict zone where ships are being targeted, mines are allegedly being laid, refineries are being struck by drones, and the countries that depend most heavily on that route are beginning to realize that the assumptions their entire industrial economies were built on may not hold anymore. That question isn't abstract. It's not a simulation. It's the situation unfolding right now, and the consequences of it don't stay in the Middle East. They travel through shipping lanes and into refineries. They move through gas pumps and into inflation reports. They land on the desks of Federal Reserve officials who are already navigating an extraordinarily difficult policy environment. And eventually, they reach into every corner of the global financial system in ways that most people won't fully understand until they're already living inside the consequences and wondering how it happened so fast. The Strait of Hormuz is a passage of water roughly 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, sitting between Iran on one side and Oman and the United Arab Emirates on the other. 21 miles, that's narrower than many American metropolitan areas are from edge to edge. And through that 21-mile gap, every single day under normal operating conditions, flows roughly 20% of the world's total oil supply. Not 20% of Middle Eastern oil, 20% of all the oil the entire world consumes daily. Approximately 17 to 20 million barrels per day move through that corridor. The cargo isn't limited to crude oil. The strait carries liquefied natural gas, refined petroleum products, diesel, jet fuel, and gasoline that power industrial economies from Asia to Europe. It is, without any exaggeration, the single most economically critical maritime choke point on Earth. There are other important waterways. The Suez Canal matters. The Strait of Malacca matters. The Bab el-Mandeb matters. But none of them carry the specific combination of volume, concentration, and irreplaceability that defines the Strait of Hormuz. If the Suez Canal closes, you reroute around the Cape of Good Hope. You lose 2 weeks and a significant amount of money, but the cargo eventually arrives. If the Strait of Hormuz closes, there is no reroute. There is no alternative corridor that can absorb that volume. The oil either moves through it or it doesn't move at all. That is a fundamentally different kind of vulnerability. And the global economy has spent decades assuming it would never actually be tested at scale. What is happening there right now is not a minor escalation that will resolve itself in a new cycle. Oil flow through the strait has reportedly collapsed under the pressure of the current conflict by a margin that would have seemed unthinkable just months ago. Aramco, the single largest oil company on the planet by production volume and market capitalization, suspended operations at its biggest refinery following a drone strike. China, which under normal circumstances is a net exporter of refined fuel products to global markets, halted its diesel and gasoline exports entirely as Beijing scrambled to manage domestic supply concerns. Japan, a country with almost no domestic energy resources whatsoever, that imports virtually every barrel of oil its economy consumes, formally requested emergency crude releases from international reserves. Even Chinese vessels, despite the complex and often opaque geopolitical relationship between Beijing and Tehran, began avoiding the strait entirely after recent attacks on commercial shipping. When Chinese ships won't sail a route because it's too dangerous for commercial operations, you are getting a clear signal about the severity of what is actually happening on the ground. The G7 nations coordinated a release of 400 million barrels from strategic petroleum reserves. 400 million barrels sounds like an enormous intervention until you run the math. It represents roughly 20 days of the supply that the strait normally moves under operating conditions. 20 days. That is the buffer standing between the current situation and a supply shock with no near-term resolution. To fully understand why this matters beyond the borders of the Middle East, you need to understand who actually depends on this waterway and what happens to their economies when it stops functioning at normal capacity. India is the world's third largest oil importer, and a significant share of its energy supply moves through the Strait of Hormuz. India is also one of the fastest growing major economies on the planet, with hundreds of millions of people whose improving living standards are directly tied to energy availability and price stability. When oil prices spike sharply, Indian inflation rises. Industrial output slows. The rupee faces depreciation pressure. Foreign exchange reserves get drawn down defending the currency. The economic progress of a generation can be meaningfully eroded within months of a sustained energy price shock. China runs the world's largest manufacturing operation and the second largest economy, and it does so almost entirely on imported energy. Its factories, its shipping infrastructure, its construction sector, and its export-driven economic model all depend on affordable energy flowing reliably through that strait day after day. Japan has essentially zero domestic fossil fuel resources. Every barrel of oil Japan uses to generate electricity, run its rail and road networks, power its industrial base, and heat its residential buildings is imported. Remove affordable access to imported oil, and Japan's economy faces an immediate structural crisis, with no short-term domestic substitute available. Saudi Arabia, which sits on some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world, exports between 80 and 90% of its oil production through the Strait of Hormuz. Saudi Arabia's government budget, its social stability programs, its sovereign wealth fund investments, and the entire economic model that holds the kingdom together are priced in barrels per day flowing through that 21-mile gap. When analysts use the phrase chokepoint to describe the Strait of Hormuz, this is the full weight of what that word means. Disruption. There is not one country's problem. It is everybody's problem, arriving simultaneously, with no clean mechanism for absorbing the shock. The inflation consequences of sustained disruption are not speculative projections. They are mechanical relationships that operate through the structure of the global economy regardless of policy intentions. Oil is not just fuel for transportation. Oil is the feedstock for plastics, for pharmaceuticals, for fertilizers that grow the food the world eats, for synthetic fabrics, for industrial chemicals, for thousands of products that people use without ever thinking about their petrochemical origins. Oil powers the trucks that move goods from warehouses to stores. It powers the container ships that carry manufactured products across oceans. It powers the aircraft that move high-value cargo and business travelers. When oil prices rise sharply and remain elevated for an extended period, the cost increases don't stay isolated inside the energy sector. They propagate. They spread into food prices because fertilizer is petroleum-derived and agricultural equipment runs on diesel. They spread into the prices of consumer goods because manufacturing costs rise and shipping costs rise, and those increases move through supply chains into retail prices. They spread into services because businesses facing higher operating costs have limited options beyond passing those costs on to customers. And when inflation spreads through an economy in this way, the Federal Reserve faces a dilemma that has no clean resolution. The Fed's mandate requires it to control inflation while supporting maximum employment. Rising oil-driven inflation pushes against rate cuts, but holding rates tight at a moment when other parts of the economy are showing signs of stress creates its own set of risks. The Fed had been receiving data that suggested the disinflationary trend was intact and that rate cuts might be approaching. That data is now stale. It was collected before the most recent escalation in global energy markets. The new Fed chair is stepping into a situation where the policy calculus has shifted under their feet before they've even had time to establish a baseline. Cut rates based on outdated data and risk embedding rising inflation more deeply. Hold rates and risk stalling an already cautious economy. Signal cuts without acting and watch credibility erode when the inflation numbers contradict the message. There is no comfortable path. And the political dimension compounds the difficulty because high inflation and elevated interest rates heading into a midterm election cycle create pressures on both policymakers and the institutions that are supposed to be independent of political pressure. Geopolitical crises have a long and well-documented history of accelerating financial innovation, not because crisis makes people suddenly creative in some hopeful, optimistic sense, but because crisis exposes the fragility of existing systems in ways that careful analysis during peacetime never quite manages to communicate with sufficient urgency. When systems break under stress, the political and economic will to build something more resilient materializes in ways it simply doesn't during stable periods. The SWIFT international payment network was itself partly a response to the inefficiencies and coordination problems of earlier correspondent banking arrangements. The eurodollar market developed in part because of Cold War geopolitical tensions that made holding dollars in American banks feel strategically uncomfortable to certain sovereign actors. The entire history of financial infrastructure is populated with systems that were not built during peaceful, methodical planning cycles, but in the middle of, or immediately following, periods of significant stress and disruption. Crisis doesn't just destroy existing infrastructure. It creates the conditions under which new infrastructure gets built and adopted at a pace that would have seemed impossible during calmer times. What is different now compared to previous geopolitical stress cycles is the existence of programmable distributed ledger technology that is not a prototype or a white paper. It is operational. It is being tested by real institutions managing real capital. It is already capable of settling transactions across borders in seconds without requiring the kind of correspondent banking chains that the current global payment infrastructure depends on. Cross-border payments today often involve multiple intermediary banks in multiple jurisdictions, multiple currency conversions, multiple compliance checkpoints, and multiple points where a transaction can be delayed, rejected, reversed, or scrutinized by parties that are not the sender or the receiver. Each intermediary step is a friction point. Each friction point has a cost. Each cost accumulates. And in a world where geopolitical tensions are actively restructuring trade relationships and some of the financial infrastructure underpinning those relationships is under demonstrable stress, the structural case for faster, more direct, more programmable settlement systems becomes more compelling in ways that go beyond any particular asset's price movement. This is the context in which the conversation around blockchain-based financial infrastructure becomes analytically serious rather than speculative. XRP and the XRP ledger have been positioned from the earliest days of Ripple's development as a company as infrastructure for cross-border liquidity and settlement. The original problem they identified was not invented for a pitch deck. It was real, and it remains real. International payments require pre-funded correspondent accounts sitting in banks in every market an institution wants to operate in. That pre-funding requirement is capital that cannot be deployed productively. It sits idle, earning minimal returns, waiting to facilitate transactions that may or may not materialize. A neutral bridge asset capable of moving value across jurisdictions in seconds without requiring either party to hold the other's currency addresses a structural inefficiency that costs the global financial system enormous amounts of money and time. In the context of a world where some governments and institutions are actively searching for settlement mechanisms that don't route exclusively through systems that could be weaponized as instruments of foreign policy, and where the speed and cost of moving value across borders is increasingly a strategic variable rather than just an operational one, the infrastructure thesis around digital settlement layers gains weight. It is important to be precise here. This is not a claim that XRP will be adopted to settle oil contracts between sovereign states. No such arrangement exists in documented form, and asserting it as fact would be misleading. What is accurate is that the conditions creating pressure on existing financial infrastructure are precisely the conditions that have historically driven adoption of new financial infrastructure. The question of which digital settlement systems are most technically capable, most regulatory compliant, and most embedded in institutional relationships when that adoption wave accelerates is genuinely important and genuinely unresolved. The larger story here may not be about any individual asset, any single company, or any specific technology. It may be about a structural transformation in how the global financial system moves, settles, and accounts for value. A transformation that has been building slowly and largely invisibly for years, and is now being accelerated by the kind of geopolitical pressure that historically reshapes economic systems at their foundations. The dollar's position as the world's reserve currency is itself a product of geopolitical history, not technological superiority. The petrodollar arrangement that underpinned much of the post-1970s global financial order was a geopolitical construction. The decision to weaponize access to SWIFT as a foreign policy tool changed the calculus for multiple sovereign actors simultaneously. Every major shift in global financial architecture has occurred at the intersection of geopolitical necessity and technological capability. We are sitting inside one of those intersections right now. The necessity is visible. The technology exists and is operational. The regulatory frameworks are being contested and constructed simultaneously across multiple jurisdictions. The institutions that will operate the financial infrastructure of the next 20 to 30 years are making consequential decisions right now, most of them quietly, about which rails they want to build on, which systems they want to trust, and which counterparties they want to depend on. Those decisions will not be announced with press releases. They will become visible in retrospect, the way almost all infrastructure decisions do, long after the choices that mattered most have already been made. If the global financial system is being forced to modernize under the pressure of real geopolitical disruption, which networks will become the rails of the next economic order won't be determined by which tokens trend on social media. It will be determined by which infrastructure solves real problems reliably, at scale, under the conditions that actually exist in the world.